Good Sunday afternoon, everyone. Tom Barnico, Director of Basketball Training for the Tri-City Area Officials Association. Another Sunday blog post, just catching up in between or at halftime of the first playoff game here. Pretty decent one so far between the Chiefs and the Bengals. Anyway, long story short is that we've got another week under our belts. We're heading into February. I know sometimes that February can kind of be the dog days of February for a lot of officials because we're kind of coming off the adrenaline of the first month or two of the season, and we've still got a month left before the playoffs start in March. But I think February is the time where we can refine a lot of our skills, focus on getting better, making substantial changes specifically based on some goals and objectives that we set before the season, maybe doing a 60-day review of how we feel that the season has gone for us personally. So with all that being said, what I wanted to focus on today was, as you can see at the top, effective post-gaming habits. We put a lot of emphasis on pre-gaming, and rightfully so. I think pre-gaming is the most important part of officiating, whether it be basketball, baseball, football, volleyball, track, whatever the case may be. But today specifically, I think it's good and it's timely to talk about if we are consistently post-gaming in a way that allows us to become better officials. So I've got two slides that I wanted to cover today. The first slide is going to go over just some basic theories and philosophies on how to post game. The second slide is going to be more focused on questions that you can ask yourself during your post game. Okay, so let's just start at the top here. A good post game requires self-awareness and a desire to hear the truth. Now, I say this because we have to be willing to discuss some what could be some hard subject matter with our crew after the game is over, especially if the game didn't go well. If there was a lot of chippiness, if the game kind of digressed into pushing and shoving, or a lot of talking back and forth between players, or maybe the environment within the game itself just took a turn for the worse as the game was going along, we obviously need to investigate why that happened. What did we do to allow that to happen, right? And I understand that sometimes there's factors that are beyond what we can control as officials, especially when you're talking about rivalry games or games where the top two teams in the conference are playing. But it takes a lot of self-awareness and a desire to hear the truth to really get to the bottom of what didn't go as well during the game as the crew had planned on it going. As I mentioned in this sub-bullet point here, officials don't get better if they hide from their shortcomings. And really, that's the entire premise. The premise of effective post-gaming is not to always tell yourself things went well, things went really well, because they won't. There's going to be games throughout the season where things do go well and you feel like you've nailed the game, but there's going to be other games where you're questioning what went wrong, whether it was before the game, during the game, as the game was coming to a conclusion. Where did that game go sideways, and what impact did I have on that game going sideways? And unless you are willing to be truthful with yourself, unless you are willing to bring those shortcomings out in the open and say, boy, Barnico, you were really deficient in these areas tonight and you got to get a lot better. If you're not willing to have that conversation with yourself, chances are that over time, these issues are going to continue to rear their head in the games that you officiate. So let's go down to the second bullet point. Issues that came up during the game should be addressed with the crew immediately upon returning to the locker room. It aids in remembering details and situations. Sometimes we have the opportunity to ride to and from games with our partners, with either the other official or the other two officials that we are doing the game with. Sometimes we do not. Either way, whether you're riding back with your crew or not, I would always recommend post gaming as a crew in the locker room immediately after the game is over. There have been many times where I wanted to post game a specific situation with the crew, and we get talking after the game and I forget about it until after I leave the gym and I'm in the car by myself, and I immediately think, oh yeah, I wanted to talk about X, Y, and Z, but because we were talking about something that wasn't even necessarily relevant to the game that just took place, I completely forgot about it. So especially if there are issues that come up during the game that you specifically want to address, I would recommend having it be the first thing that you do in the locker room after the game is over, post gaming those situations with your with the one or two other people on your crew. Now, that's not to say you walk in the locker room and you immediately come out with, boy, we sucked out there. I don't think that's really overly beneficial. I think my preference is always asking questions and getting feedback. For instance, that game seemed to get really out of hand in the fourth quarter. There was a lot of taunting. There was a lot of back and forth. There were a lot of elbows in the post. There was a lot of perimeter players pushing off one another to try to create space. What happened during the game that we got to that point and we couldn't get it back? Posing the question, letting the crew answer those questions instead of saying, boy, we were really deficient tonight. It allows the other people on the crew to have input and not immediately feel like they want to shut down, because you're now creating the same situation in the locker room that was being created on the court with a lot of tension, a lot of conflict. And I get it. Some people's personalities are to address conflict head on. And if you read over the bullet points I've got here, I'm not necessarily arguing that you shouldn't have these talking points that could lead to conflict. But what I am saying is that I would not recommend starting the conversation with conflict, because chances are you've just come off the court where there was a lot of conflict and emotions are running high. Number one. Number two, things could be said without giving much thought that an official could ultimately regret saying later on if they disagree with the other two members of the crew or whatever the case may be. And that brings up my final point, and then I'll go down to the next bullet point. Everybody's opinions matter. Everybody's opinions are just as valuable as the other person or people on that crew. So what you shouldn't do is, if you're the conversation starter, or if you disagree with what one of your other officials is saying, you shouldn't immediately shut that other person down. If you need to ask more questions, if you need to ask further questions to more clearly define what another official is talking about, maybe they're bringing up a point that you disagree with, ask them questions to understand why they feel the way that they feel. Don't just assume, or don't just read into what they're trying to tell you, okay? Get a definitive answer to understand the mindset that that person has and how they are thinking about what was obviously a highly volatile situation. Everyone's opinions matter. Nobody's opinion is more important than another person. I don't care if you have 1 year or 51 years. Everyone on that crew has a voice that's equal, and that voice has just as much value as anyone else. Now, if there's an opportunity for some mentorship of a newer official by all means, go ahead and mentor, but do it in a way that isn't in your face and aggressive, because we're all here to learn. We're all here to get better. We're all here to try to officiate the game as best as we can as individuals. And everyone's got different officiating ceilings, right? No two officials are the same. I could go on a football field and completely underwhelm the other 5 people or 6 people on my crew because I don't know what I'm doing. Okay. Having awareness of your skill level and your abilities as an official will help you immensely take criticism, whether it ends up being constructive or not, in a post-game situation. If things went well as a crew, going down to the 3rd bullet point now, if things went well as a crew, pinpoint key elements of the game that were positive instead of just saying, we had a good game. Why? Ask yourself the why questions. Why did we have a good game? Why did things go wrong? What specifically led us to feeling like we as a crew really nailed that game? The game had a good flow. That's something that I always have a very difficult time defining. What made that game flow well? Just saying it had a good flow to it. Yeah, we all kind of understand what a flow means, but what specifically made that game have a good flow? Was it getting an understanding from players and coaches early on about what was and what was not going to be accepted as far as behavior is concerned? Was it getting the ball in play in a timely manner? Was it something as simple as getting players on and off the court during timeouts? What made that game flow well? Define that. And I think that will help you and the other people on your crew understand better what you can do in the future to ensure that those games that you work in the future have that same flow. 4th bullet point, each official should be given the opportunity to discuss the game. Don't rely only on the R to generate conversation. Now, I say this, I do encourage the R, especially if there are situations that happen during the game that obviously made the crew either uncomfortable or work suboptimally. I think it is the responsibility of the R to at least start the conversation. However, that doesn't mean that if the R doesn't generate that conversation, that the U or the U1 or U2, depending on if you're in a 2-person or 3-person crew, anyone can start the conversation if they see fit. Especially if something happened to that person individually that they want to address. But again, my ask of any R would be to pinpoint and start the conversation by pinpointing either what went right specifically, talking specifics, or what went wrong specifically, talking in specifics. Okay. That conversation generation is so vitally important to building up the title here, effective post-game habits. That's where we grow. We grow after we experience a game and we can have the self-awareness and that real conversation with ourselves and our crew to say, here's where we need to get better. Leaving your ego at the door. I think by now, everyone kind of gets the idea of what I mean by leaving your ego at the door. You're going to have good games as a crew during the season. And you're going to have bad games. You're going to have good halves, and you're going to have bad halves. You're going to have good quarters and you're going to have bad quarters. There's been times where I have 2 really solid minutes in a game as an official, and then for some reason or another, I just blank on the next 2 minutes. That happens. It happens to everyone. Don't think that because you have a good first half and a terrible second half, that you're the only official on the planet that happens to. It doesn't. It happens to everyone, whether they want to admit it to themselves or not. The fact of the matter in the reality of what we do when we officiate is such that we are going to have good times and bad times. And we need to leave our ego at the door in order to understand what made it good, what made it bad, what do we need to continue to do to keep it good, and what do we need to do differently to make it better if something went wrong. I kind of covered that second bullet point just a couple minutes ago. While you should expect yourself to have 100% focus 100% of the time, it's not going to happen. It's why we always talk about, especially in games where maybe we're between the third and fourth quarter, it's a 20 to 30 point differential. We remind ourselves all the time, especially like the crews that I work on. One of the things that I always bring up is let's keep our focus. And the reason that you will find a lot of officials reminding one another of that is because those are the situations in which you're going to lose your focus, or you have the propensity to lose your focus. I think it's natural for a human being to lose focus when the situation around them dictates that 80% of their focus would be acceptable. In a 30-point game, is it necessary for us to have 100% of the focus? I would argue yes. And if the play is kind of substandard, especially from one team, focus on something else. Focus on, did the clock start and stop at the right times? Did they switch the arrow on a held ball? Are you effectively communicating one-on-one and double bonus to your partners? Are you effectively communicating where the ball is going out of bounds? Work on those things. Always be working to get better. Never settle for 80% of your focus in any game. Now, you might need to redirect your brain activity to understand where you could put more of your focus so that you are offering 100%, but do the things that make yourself better. Post-game discussions assist in identifying deficiencies that the crew had, both individually and collectively. And I think by now, this all goes without saying. So, the next slide, questions to ask yourself when you are post-gaming. So I've put a couple different, or I've taken a couple different angles here. Questions to ask yourself, and then questions to ask the crew. So let's start at the top. These are more questions to ask yourself. Okay. What are 2 things that I did well during that game? Regardless of how bad the game went, or you feel the game went, or how poorly the other officials on your crew are telling that game went. And I don't care if you have to wait until you're in the car to think about it, but you need to think about, what are 2 things that I did well during that game? Even the game that was just, and everyone else knows that game was not officiated adequately. There were at least a couple things that you did well during that game or before that game that you should congratulate yourself on. I'm not saying that everyone has to get a trophy, but if we're not reinforcing things that we do well, we're never going to improve. We're always going to be looking over our shoulder at our own advice. And that's not healthy. That's not healthy in officiating. That's not really healthy in any walk of life. So always be cognizant of what you did well during the game. Did you report fouls well? Did you run around the players to report fouls instead of running through them? What was your violation and foul calls substandard? Maybe. Okay. But did you control emotions? Did you control player emotions? Did you control coach emotions? Did you answer the coach's questions effectively? Did you fall, did you not allow yourself to fall in the trap of answering statements? Pick 2 things that you did well. Okay. Did I prepare differently before the game, which allowed me to do those things well? Ask yourself these questions, because if you don't know why you did them well, you won't do them well for the rest of the season. But if you have a firm grasp and understanding of why those things went well, you're much more likely to repeat them in the future. And then you can transition to, what are 2 things that I did not do well during that game? This goes back to what I was just talking about when I was saying that we need to leave our ego at the door. What are 2 things I did not do well? Should I have personally pre-gamed differently so I wasn't so deficient in these areas? Hopefully everyone has at least tried to take the suggestion that I had earlier in the year about pre-gaming with themselves, not just as a crew, but pre-gaming with yourself. A lot of times I do this in the car on the way to the game, or possibly when I'm out watching the game that is taking place before me. Or if I'm the first game of the night, I'm definitely doing it in the car on the way to the game. But pre-game with yourself. Not only will it better prepare you personally, but especially if you're the R, I think it will do an excellent job of refining your own pregame that you're going to give to the crew as a whole. If you pregame with yourself effectively, you're going to pregame with the crew much better. So let's skip down to the next group of bullet points. If you are the R on the game in your post gaming, did I pregame well enough so that everyone was on the same page? Okay. If we were deficient as a crew, could we attribute our deficiencies to anything not discussed during my pregame? In the pregame, maybe you as the R didn't discuss technical foul administration. During the game, you had a technical foul, and maybe it took you 7 or 8 minutes. And I'm exaggerating here, but maybe it took you longer than should be expected to understand everything from who the technical foul was on. Was it direct or indirect to a coach? What's going to be the order of administration to get the ball back in play? Were there any other free throws that needed to be or that need to be part of the workflow of the game flow? Because if you're taking a while to do that, my guess is that you probably didn't pregame that as a crew effectively. And look, I completely understand that there are things that a crew pregames that you forget about. Number one, by the time you're out on the court. Number two, by the time it actually happens. But thinking about basketball, that's what pre-gaming and post-gaming is about. Specifically pre-gaming. Pre-gaming is important because it allows me to think about basketball. It allows me to forget about a bad day that I had at work. It allows me to forget about maybe things that are going on at home. It allows me to forget about pretty much anything else besides what's going to happen over the next couple of hours and how I can be the best official that I can be. And the way that I do that, the way that I get myself in that mindset is to pregame. Pregame by myself and pregame with my crew. This leads us to the second bullet point. If I'm the R and we have things that we didn't discuss during the pregame that came up during the game, what could I include in future pregames to prevent any issues of misunderstanding from happening again? The crew wasn't on the same page with something. I didn't pregame it. How can I incorporate that into my future pregames in order to have that discussion? You know, I know some people use charts or handouts on pre-gaming. Some people just kind of wing it. I don't really care what methodology you use. I'm judging the veracity of a pregame based on the content provided. And if that content is deficient and something comes up during the game that exacerbates that deficiency, we need to address that as a crew after the game is over, number one. And number two, I need to address it better myself so that I can pregame more effectively in the future. Now let's go down. If you were a you on a two-man crew or two-person crew, excuse me, or if you were U1 or U2 on a three-person crew, was the pregame given by the R sufficient? This isn't necessarily a question that I want you to answer as a crew. What I want you to do is think about, was the pregame given by R sufficient? Answer that question in your own mind. Then go on from there. Was there material covered in the pregame that was helpful? Was there material not covered in the pregame that hurt you as a crew? And here's the most important question, and why I ask you to reflect on if the pregame given by the R was sufficient. Because if there are positive things that the R has talked about before the game that you can include in your own pregame, do it. If there's a deficiency that the R didn't talk about before the game in their pregame, and you have that same deficiency and you know it, add it in to your own pregame. I'll give you an example. 2 weeks ago, I was working with Mike Steinkraus at Mount Pleasant. And Mike did something that I had never experienced in a pregame before. What he did is he went around and assigned each of the three of us a spot on the court and asked us how we were going to officiate the game from that spot. So I believe I was the lead. Mike was the trail, and our third official, and I apologize, I can't remember who it was right offhand, but our third official was the center. Okay. And he asked us, how are you going to officiate the games or the game from that spot on the floor? So I went through my philosophies as a lead official. Mike went through his philosophies as the center or the trail official. And again, I know our third is watching this, and I apologize for not being able to remember off the top of my head who our third official was. So I do apologize for that. But Mike did something innovative that I had never thought of doing before. And I thought to myself, you know what? That's pretty good. I'm going to try doing that in the future. I'm going to try to see how the other officials on my crew get a better understanding of how they're going to officiate the game from their perspective, from that spot on the floor. Been officiating 20 years. This is the first time I ever thought about doing it. And I certainly wasn't creative enough to think about doing it. I had to rely on another official, and that's fine. How much, reflect on your own officiating in the past and think about how much of the official you are right now is predicated on what you've learned from other people. Leave your ego at the door and be willing to learn from other people who do things better than you do them. And if someone does something that you don't really care for, use that as a learning process too. So down to these last 2 bullet points. Are there areas of my officiating that I consistently find myself questioning? Am I improving in the areas that I wanted to improve prior to the season starting? All right. These are the types of questions I ask myself in my post game, in the car, on the way home, or once I get home. These 2 questions right here. I ask myself these questions after every game because I want to always be thinking about my consistency as an official and ensuring that I'm improving on areas that I know I'm deficient in. I've probably mentioned this either in the vlog posts or with other people that I've worked with throughout the year. One thing that I have been working on this entire year is trying to limit my double whistles when it's very clear that I'm going out of my area on a call that if I would have delayed my whistle another half to full second, the other official whose PCA I called the play in would have 95% of the time, they would have gotten the same foul call that I would have. But because I was so fast on the whistle, it forced us into a double whistle situation. And I had to give that up to the secondary official, or I'm sorry, to the official who was officiating their own primary. Now, I'm not someone who's going to talk bad or talk down about double whistles because they certainly do happen. But for me personally, I know that I have to stop the eye wandering into my secondary coverage area when I know for sure that the official who's got that primary coverage area has it covered. Stay in your lane, Tom. That's what I've been trying to tell myself all year. And I ask myself these questions after every game because I want to take stock and inventory on whether I'm actually getting better, whether things are getting worse. Hopefully they're at least stagnant though. Okay. But stagnant doesn't work for me. Getting better is what works for me. So if I'm 2 months into the season and I still feel like I'm calling a lot of plays during a game in my secondary coverage area, getting double whistles in situations that, again, if I delayed just a hair longer, another official would have gotten it. If I'm not improving in that area, I need to really look into myself and say, what's going on? Why have you given yourself 60 days and you haven't gotten better? That's what post gaming is about. Getting us better, excuse me, getting us better as an individual and getting us better as a crew. So that's what I've got this week on post gaming. Finally, one last thing. I want to give a shout out to Kevin Sinicki. He pointed out a discrepancy that I had in last week's presentation about technical fouls. In last week's vlog, I had talked about technical fouls as far as illegal numbers, players wearing illegal numbers during a game. Okay, so I'm going to pull it right out of, and I'm making sure that I'm using the 2021-2022 rule book because I made a mistake. Kevin recognized that mistake and he got in touch with me and said, you might want to look into this. And what I ended up realizing is I was using an old rule book by mistake, but I've got this year's rule book. So the discrepancy last week was in terms of players wearing illegal numbers on the court. Okay. So I had mistakenly said, I forget now. I actually forget now what I mistakenly said. But long story short, I believe last week I said that having an illegal jersey or an illegal number on a jersey was a player technical foul. And it is not. It used to be, but it is now a direct technical foul to a head coach. And I'm looking at it right here. So the type or the types of infractions that would lead to a direct technical foul on a head coach: unsporting conduct, off the bench or outside the box, not replacing a player as required in 15 seconds, playing a disqualified player, illegal jersey, pants, number. That's a direct technical foul to a head coach. And then you've got team members leaving the court or the bench for an unauthorized reason. So illegal jersey, pants, and number is a direct technical foul to a head coach. I'll say that again. Illegal number, direct technical foul to a head coach, which means that they have to sit once that illegal number is recognized. Okay. So any illegal jersey, any illegal shorts, any illegal number, if there is any illegality to that player's uniform, that is a direct technical foul to the head coach. The head coach needs to sit. So again, last week I mistakenly said that illegal number or illegal jersey or shorts was a player technical foul, which means that it wouldn't have been charged either indirectly or directly to the head coach. The 2021-2022 rule book very clearly states that an illegal jersey, pants, or number is a direct technical foul to a head coach, which means that head coach has to sit for the rest of the game. And if they get a second direct or two more indirects, they are ejected from the contest. So again, thank you, Kevin, for catching me on that. And hopefully everyone found this week's post-gaming vlog to be beneficial. Good luck this first week of February. And as I mentioned before, this is the month where we really get better, where we can really take a step back and look at where we've come from the beginning of the season and take that inventory on where we've gotten better. And there could be a couple areas where maybe we got a little bit worse. We got lackadaisical, but please have the conversation with yourself. And I promise you that it will make you a better official. Till next week, everyone. Thank you very much.